Welcome to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. And Mike, after a few weeks, a little bit of hiatus, some time away, we are back. And we're not the only ones that are back, though. There are other things going on here.
We're back. Our politicians are back. Municipally, we're going to see city council starting up again. Ottawa, Queen's Park, they're all heading back. And I know when they left at the beginning of summer, the biggest thing in the media and the biggest thing they were all talking about was the housing crisis, housing affordability, and more importantly, housing availability. And certainly going back in this fall, they better have their ducks lined up, because that is going to be the topic that all Canadians want them to be focusing on.
And it'll be interesting, Mike, because during these last few weeks, there have been a number of things that have come across our screens, our social media platforms, the headlines, et cetera. And I think today is a great day to go and take a look at some of those things. The name of the show, we're talking about obviously rents being high and rates being high, and is that unprecedented? There's that buzzword. Is that an anomaly? How normal or how usual is it that we see that? I think we'll also go in and dive into that
For sure.
as well today.
Let's do it. And I think starting with rates, it's, in the shorter term of history there, rates being as high as they are is certainly unprecedented. There's a whole generation out there who have not seen rates as high as they are now. If you're 40 or over, chances are you remember, if not with your own home, with your parents dealing with interest rates that were above 10% even going back 70s and 80s. But right now, people are grappling with that. And it's having an impact on existing homeowners. It's having an impact on those who are hoping to become homeowners, and we can delve into that a little bit. But it is interesting as well that housing prices have been coming down. We've seen rental rates either holding or going up somewhat. So let's talk a little bit about why that might be.
Yeah, and Mike, I think it's also worth talking about the fact that while we in the headlines may read about and hear national headlines and national statistics, we've always been careful to say there are also regional or more localized realities. And
and that's always been my struggle with looking, because it's too easy to cherry pick for your agenda, whatever it may be, whether you're a politician or media, for your story. You can cherry pick things to support, because you can look at the national numbers, you can look at that region or this region, but I think it comes down to regional overall.
And one of the things I've always appreciated about you is you're the eternal optimist, and you wanted to believe that the system will sustain the system. There will always be a good time. And the fact of the matter is, when we talk things out, and I think this is really important, what we're looking at today, and we've heard us say this before, forget the headlines. There's a lot of rationale, there's a lot of logic behind many of the things that we're dealing with today. Doesn't mean that anybody likes it, doesn't mean that you're going to like any one instance or scenario, but there's a lot of reason behind it. You talked about rates. Well, listen, house prices are off the peak of a year ago, and regardless of who you listen to now, pretty much unanimously the headlines are saying 20 to 30% down.
Yeah.
Okay, we're 20% down.
Now we're talking from
about a year and
June
a half
to June,
ago.
July to July. Or are we talking about that January 2021 peak until now?
Well, we'll talk about it as
this is where you can cherry pick,
And that's just it. How are you interpreting the data? So off the peak, we're down 20 to 30%.
Yes.
But really, where were we when we were at the peak?
Well, that's it.
So when we look at house value and house affordability, et cetera, there are always things. You can talk about it during COVID. You could talk about that piece of plywood that you used to buy at the big box hardware store that you paid one price for pre-COVID, and then what was the price of that piece of plywood during COVID? It was 400% higher than it was before, and the excuse that we were given was, oh, it's COVID, oh, it's supply and demand. Well, you can look at the same with housing now, right? There was supply and demand. There was a rush of people who wanted to get out of the GTA, for example. There was a rush of people who wanted to move to the East Coast or to the Midwest or wherever it was, and they found opportunity there because they were no longer tied to the desk.
Yeah, and just for some perspective, and I pointed it out in previous episodes here, is when we're talking about that peak and we're talking about how much prices have dropped with relation to that peak. Keep in mind that peak was January, February of 2021. You only have to go back, anywhere from say 3 to 6 months prior to that peak to find housing prices right around where they are today.
Much more normalized, we'll call it.
And they had been climbing to reach that point too. So we didn't drop to an unprecedented low. We had an amazing value gain over a 6-month period, and then it was taken back. It's like,
Mike, I'm going to put some things into perspective for you, okay? And just go with me on this, okay? When COVID happened, suddenly everybody went to get a household pet. People got married. We made babies. We bought RVs.
Speak for yourself.
We're now beyond COVID. People have given back their pets, which is ridiculous. Divorces are happening. That RV that people paid ridiculous amounts of money for, if you go on social media or in the buy and trade magazines,
them at a greatly reduced price.
They are 52% off. Right? That $52,000 RV is now $26,000, $25,000. Right? What happened during the peak is people lost their minds. They lost all sense of reason.
We became the me generation for sure.
It's not that the house prices went up. Is that people went into such a mode of hysteria that they actually threw all caution to the wind, all sense of reason and logic to the wind. They actually waived their right to home inspection. They waived their right to financing conditions.
Many were no longer thinking long term. They were thinking just, what can I do to get that dopamine rush in the next 48 hours that I need to have?
FOMO. Fear of missing out.
Well,
people literally thought that if they didn't buy today, they were never going to buy. Today, where are we? We're not at a 20 to 30% reduction in the value of a home.
No.
We're at a 20 to 30% correction due to people coming to their senses or having their senses brought to them.
And if I may, to compare the RV purchase and sale to a house purchase and sale, the RV is a toy. It's something we can live without, something many people wanted but could just as easily part with. Whereas a house is something all of us require, whether we own or we rent. It's still a necessity for most of us.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to bring it up later on, but we might as well go there now. And I think this is okay because I don't think we're going to spend too much time on it. But similar to the RV, is the homes that are now considered secondary homes or vacation homes or luxury homes, cottage country,
that would categorize similar to the RV.
They, I think, are legitimately seeing a bit of a depression because of a lack of demand. That same lack of demand is not the same lack of demand that we're seeing in the built-up area, or sort of the same price adjustments that we're seeing in the built-up areas.
Two different products.
I think people really are struggling, and they're realizing, okay, again, people bought not just RVs, they bought cottages, right?
Times are tough. The toys are the first things to go.
Absolutely.
The motorcycle, the RV, cutting back on vacations. And if it's a cottage, secondary home, nowadays there's more of an option for people than we may have had in a recession of 20, 25 years ago to, do the bed and breakfast type scenario, renting your cottage out. That's an easier proposition now than it was at any time in the past, and more people are taking advantage of it.
But what's the real story in Simcoe County in terms of pricing? And I think you mentioned that it's a little bit more stabilized than in some other jurisdictions.
I'm seeing that because when I see those, headlines that are the intent is to scare. Worst case scenario type headlines, citing examples in here or there or wherever. I know I pay attention to what's happening in Prince Edward Island, Charlottetown. My wife's family's there. And I've seen prices recede there at a greater rate and to a greater extent percentage-wise than we've seen here in Barrie. And again, Barrie, I think, does have some unique characteristics compared with other municipalities of similar sizes across the country, and that is its proximity to the GTA and the influence of those who want to leave the city because the prices there are that much more unaffordable. So that, call it pressure or just call it steady stream or continuing stream of people, helps to regulate our prices. So whereas there was the potential for prices to go far lower as a result of high interest rates, that helped to moderate things. And
I'm just going to suggest this, Mike. I think this is a valuable principle to take into consideration. When everyone else is doing it, is the time to stop and think, is now the time for me to be doing it? Because opportunity is when someone else isn't necessarily, or everyone else isn't.
When everyone else
doing
starts doing what you thought was a good, unique idea, is the time for you to step out.
Exactly.
Cash out.
Exactly. Absolutely. So with regard to Prince Edward Island or other vacation and no offense to the folks in Prince Edward Island, just similar eastern provinces or west.
It was a COVID thing too. You had a lot of people going, I'm going to take the early retirement, I can do the work from home. Let's start looking at houses across the country. We had a great vacation in PEI, we love it there. Let's move to PEI. So many people did. It helped drive up the prices. Many people lived through 1 or 2 winters in PEI. Many people lived through a hurricane last year that almost flattened all the trees in that province. And I think a lot of them are saying, you know what, this was fun, but it's time to get back to reality.
So for the good people of PEI and the other maritime provinces who actually were not happy about the so-called appreciation of home values, I think that they're going to start to see some reprieve there themselves. But when we come back from the break, Mike, I do want to get into a few things about.
We've made a list of things we want to touch
do.
on,
We have made a list of things. So not just about Simcoe County. I think we've established that we've got a bit of a bolstering effect or a bit of a buffer around market fluctuation because of proximity to the GTA. We'll certainly touch on what's going on in the GTA there. But when we get back, let's go into a bit of the why. And I've got a bunch of bullet points that I've put aside as to some of the reasons why we may be seeing this phenomenon or this current market characteristic.
Let's dive into that.
Absolutely. So if it's not too soon, we'll just go to break for a moment. When we come back, we will pick up on these items and talk more about why, even though rates are high, rents are high, and how that does make sense and work together. And we'll be right back after the short break.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we're into the third quarter of 2023. Summer's over, well, technically over, but it's still nice weather out there. We're coming into the fall. We're just talking about some of the influence, some of the things that are happening within our real estate market and where that may lead us. One of the things we should talk about is inventory levels of real estate locally here. And what are the influences there? Inventory numbers of homes listed for sale have been down for the better part of the year, and they remain down. Do you have any thoughts on where reasons why we may be there? And
you're smiling because I think you regret asking the question.
Well,
right
you tell me, and then I'll tell you why you're wrong. So
fair enough. Inventory's low. Again, I firmly believe that when you extract emotion, when you extract frustration with what's going on, and you actually look at really the question why, with sort of just a neutral eye as possible, there's a lot of justifications. There's a lot of reason why inventory is low, in my opinion. A few things to take into consideration. There are people who still recognize the fact that it was just a year and a half ago, when the market was seeing the high, and anybody who was thinking of selling, if they were...
No one's forgot that number that they were told their house was worth in January, February 2021. Yeah.
Absolutely. I've got things that I've not thrown out that I look at them and I'm borderline hoarding these items because I'm like, wow, do I really want to get rid of that item because I think it's worth this much, right? Well, same thing for our homes. We think our homes are worth what they were worth at the high of the market, and why would I sell now and take a loss? So we're looking at our crystal ball thinking, it's got to come back, right? So people have to take that into consideration. Do I hang out?
People play the stock market the same way too.
Do I hang around long enough and hope that I'm going to recover some of that lost money? And we have to remember, you didn't win or you didn't lose until the sold sign went up and you actually closed the transaction.
That term lost money, it's hypothetically lost. If you owned your home prior to the pandemic, if you purchased then, chances are, regardless of the ups and downs, where you are today is still a much higher point than what you purchased, what you bought in at. The only people who are really struggling here, or are going to have to wait if they want to realize an equity gain, are those who bought in those few months leading up to the peak of January 2021. And some people did buy then. They're just going to have to hold their homes a little bit longer, or take a hit when they do sell.
If you sold at the peak and then waited a couple months, went on vacation, traveled around North America, and then bought your little homestead property in Florida or somewhere in the States for a couple $100,000, great, you were ahead. You timed it perfectly, and I'm happy for you. And
if you bought at the peak?
No, if you sold at the peak
sold at the peak,
then
sorry.
bought. Sorry, if I said bought, I apologize. But if you sold at the peak and then bought after a vacation, et cetera, you timed it perfectly, and that's great. But here's the thing.
You can only know in hindsight, though.
So people are hanging on because, one, they're thinking, I'm going to wait to sell. I'm going to wait until the prices go up to sell.
Yeah.
Here's the other reason why.
Sorry, just going to interject there. If you're doing that and you're going to buy back in immediately, too, in the same market, you got to realize that if your price returns, then the house you're going to buy is also going to go up by the same factor. So
absolutely. The other thing that people are taking into consideration, though, and the reason why they're not selling, is interest rates.
Yeah, for sure.
And in fairness, interest rates, because one, they're concerned that their buyer may not qualify, or they're concerned that the bids are going to come in lower because the buyers have to readjust their budget in order to qualify. Okay. The other thing that they're thinking about is, if I sell and I still have a mortgage and I still have to buy something else,
you're now buying,
am I going to qualify at today's rate?
It's qualifying, and it's also cashing in your 2% rate that has a year or 2 years remaining on the term for your existing home.
So I've got a 2% rate. I'm 3 years into a 5-year term. I'm going to pay the interest rate differential, or the greater of that, or the 3 months interest. And for most people, it's going to be the interest rate differential. And then on top of it, I have to requalify, where before I was qualifying at a 2% qualifying rate over a 1.9% or whatever it was interest rate at the time. Now we're trying to qualify at 7, 8, 9%, depending on which bank and what type of a borrower you qualify as. Right? So that's homes, a big deal.
Yeah, and homes are sitting longer because at the peak, or through the peak of the, I don't mean the price peak, but just the peak of activity, they coincided, of the market, a greater number or greater proportion of buyers were first-time home buyers. But this was when interest rates were, again, below 2%. More people were more easily qualifying to buy a home. That pool of first-time buyers has shrunk quite a bit. And a lot of sellers or potential sellers are realizing that. If not directly realizing it, they're realizing it through seeing the house down the street from them that's now been listed for 60 to 90 days and hasn't sold, that during the whole rush would have sold within the first 3 days. So they're thinking, well, if he can't sell at that price, then I want this price. Maybe I need to sit and wait.
And I think in fairness, there are some people in the market who are quite rightly still a little bit gun shy, if you will. Certainly, we've all watched and witnessed what happened to the person who's entered into a contract when the rates were low, and within 30 to 45 days, rates went up significantly, and those people didn't qualify to actually close the deal on their home. And there are people who are mindful of that, and they're a little bit hesitant.
Yeah, and part of that gun shy, as you call it, was the phenomena of multiple bids on homes when you were buying again. If you're selling, great, you want that. But that was something prior to COVID. That was a rare anomaly, and it was certainly something sellers and their agents were not paying a whole lot of attention to, at least not in our regional market, they weren't. Because of that craziness in the market, it was conducive to having those run-ups in that, and people were deliberately pricing their homes lower. But when the market returned to a more balanced, or more of a buyer's market than seller's market, one might have thought we would see that would go away altogether. But we do still see multiple bids on homes. And it's not because there's a great rush of buyers out there as there was. It's because sellers and their agents are continuing to use that as a tool to position the house at a lower price than what market value might command, in order to encourage those bids and
Well,
then
and
hopefully
here's-
run the price up beyond what market value is.
Here's what's
We're
also
seeing that more and
happening.
more still.
Here's what's also happening, though. You've
Yeah.
still got the impact of immigration, and you've still got the impact of people who are exiting the GTA market for places that are considered more affordable. We'll get into that in a minute. So with less inventory there, it makes sense that for the pool that is interested in buying and qualified and capable of closing on a transaction with the interest rates 400% higher than they were a year and a half ago, yes, it makes sense that there is some multiple bidding activity happening.
But
Go ahead.
who is a casualty in all of that? Excuse me. Not the home seller, someone who's already in the market, but a local Simcoe County area first-time home buyer is not just competing with other first-time home buyers for that home. They're having to compete with those GTA buyers who are putting pressure on. So they've got the pressure of higher interest rates, a wavering economy right now, inflation, plus having to compete with people who quite possibly are selling a $2.5 million home to come up and buy a home here.
Mike, I've got some thoughts on that. We'll save that for later on in the show if you don't mind, because I have some thoughts, and I think we both do, in terms of what's possible and where the opportunities are.
Sure.
But the other thing that we really should talk on is the other side of that, which we've show title being rents being high. Why is that also an issue? And again, if you think about it logically, with less people selling, it's keeping more people in the rental space.
They're staying longer, so they're accumulating.
Or with less people buying because they're waiting for rates to come down, they're staying put in
the
their...
demands are increasing, and there are people who are transitioning from ownership to renter again, either through no choice. Economically, they have no choice but to sell, move into the rental market. Some have also decided, I'm going to sell because I still think there's room for prices to go down further, so I'll buy back in when it's lower. Probably seeing less of that today than we might have saw 6 months ago.
Hey, Mike, there are people who are saying, I got a 2-bedroom for $1,800. Today, I can't get a bachelor for $1,800.
Yeah.
I'm staying put. And being the fact that we're in a rent control province, unlike some other states and jurisdictions that are not too far away from where we are here in Ontario, that is currency all on its own.
For sure. And there's another aspect to that, and because I'm not running for any provincial or federal office here, I feel a little more comfortable speaking on it. It's a third rail issue, no matter how gently and correctly you enter into it, and that's talking about immigration. I fully am in support of immigration. I know we need the skills, we need the people, we need doctors, we need trades, we need engineers, and we're not producing them ourselves, but we've opened the door to 500,000 new Canadians per year, which is the new quota for this year and years going forward. That's great, 500,000 people. The reality is, though, probably 2/3 of them are going to settle into either the GTA or Vancouver, some in Calgary, some in Montreal. That puts pressure on the housing market there. And not everybody who's immigrating is going to turn around the next week and buy a home. They need to get settled in. They need to get to a position where they feel comfortable. We are going to be here long term. So chances are that's 500,000 people over the course of this year who are going to be new renters or require
Many
rental
of them,
units.
not all of them, are coming here as students seeking higher education. They're coming on visas as well.
Is that counted into the immigration quota, or is that an aside?
No, I believe it is. I believe it is considered as non-resident Canadians who are coming in, right? And regardless of how we categorize them, these are still human beings who require a roof over their head.
Yeah.
Students, whether they're immigrants or they're Canadian residents, still require a safe space and a safe room over their head.
And what's happened to student rental prices?
Well, not only the student rental prices and safe accommodations have certainly been a talking point, but here's the interesting thing, and it must be taken into consideration. These institutions for higher learning, certainly they make up about, depending on which institution it is, but many of them that we've looked at, 30% of their student population are foreign students on some form of a visa. But it's not 30% of their revenue. because they are paying a huge premium.
Oh, yeah.
And certainly we saw that impact during COVID when a lot of these visas were either not renewed or not granted, or they went back home. These institutions, colleges, lost massive amounts of their
revenue.
revenue.
What's the disadvantage to a first, second, third generation Canadian looking for post-secondary education who needs to relocate to a community where that facility is that they want, or the institution they want to go to? They're going to need student housing. The pressure on student housing prices have already been driven up. Are there people who are just saying, you know what, we can't afford to send you to university because on top of the tuition, we just can't afford the housing for you, so I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to get that secondary education.
So with that in mind, we will ponder on that while we go to break, and we'll come back and talk about it. So stay with us for more of Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. And you asked an important question. You asked a pressing question. You asked a question that's actually grabbed some headlines. Certainly around the nation, I think, I don't know about it south of the border, but certainly on our side of the border here. And that question is, with the absolute demand in not only housing from a purchase, home ownership perspective, but also rentals and also into student rentals.
Yes.
And the lack of availability here, Mike, I know, are people changing their minds? Are people saying, sorry, we can't afford to send you to university, or you're not going?
It has to be impacting.
It is impacting, and nobody who saw the headline or whether it crossed their news feed didn't stop and pay some form of attention to it. When the news investigative journalism was interviewing students who were literally homeless, living in tents, living in parks, living in substandard shelter systems, et cetera, and they are not having access. So basically,
they're doubling, tripling, quadrupling up beyond what students typically do in housing scenario.
So the marketing scenario is come to Canada, come to Ontario, and enjoy a higher quality of education or access to a higher quality of education. They get their visa, they pay their refundable or their non-refundable, and I don't know and I won't speak to it, but they pay their tuition. Let's just put it that way.
And again, at a proportionally higher rate than domestic
proportionally
students.
Higher rate than domestic students, and then they are unable to find housing, and that hit the headlines, and that's a big black eye on Canada. I don't know if it's a big black eye on the institutions.
Well, we see it here, even municipally, where there's been the push for more student housing, and there's been a little bit of resistance to it.
Some institutions offer some form of a guarantee to first-year students. You get the first pick at student residence. Second, third-year students, et cetera, can find their housing out in the community. The fact of the matter is, though, it is an issue, and this hit the headlines, and this became a talking point, I believe, with both Queen's Park and the federal government as well. And it was interesting because we talked about some of the things, we touched on the fact that we alluded to the fact that there were some interesting things that happened over the summer. Obviously,
in the political arena.
In the political arena, one of the things that I think is worth talking about is, and there's some interesting campaigns there, that if you look back at the federal election back to 2015, 2016, all the way through to the last couple of years, the government and the Prime Minister were talking about how housing and affordable housing is a priority of government. And then, most recently in 2023, suddenly the Prime Minister said, housing is not a federal agenda. It's not our a priority. It's a provincial matter.
Yeah, he said that towards the beginning of the summer, and he quickly backtracked from that statement. I'm sure he probably, as he was walking away from the microphones, he was realizing that that was a stupid thing to say. Now, whether it was part of a recovery
you have to believe it is. What did they do right after that?
You know, within a couple of weeks, they planned for a Camp David type summit with all of the, with our select ministers to discuss the very issue of housing and solving the problem of affordability.
It's called damage control. That's exactly what they did, because let's look at what was the outcome of that?
It made me feel optimistic, like, okay, finally they're realizing this and they're going to, put their nose to the grindstone and come up with some solutions. But then the next week, when the media was back at them with the microphones in their face, to the Prime Minister and to the Deputy Prime Minister, and saying, okay,
Housing Minister,
what happened? What did you guys, deduce from your putting all your heads together? And they all said, well, we're looking into this, and we're taking. There was no concrete actions or steps announced from that, which just told me that our government, this government, and maybe all government, but just this government of the day, they have to take the hit because they're the ones in there, has no answer, has no solution to dealing. There's a lot of things, they'll put money towards this, they'll announce this program, that program, this thing, but is it providing
Let me tell you,
100,000 or so homes a year we're going to need for the next 10 years going forward?
So here's
None
what
of it
happened.
even scratches the surface.
Here's what happened, and this is why the Prime Minister made that statement in the early days of summer. Mm-hmm. And that is because this Prime Minister also wants us to believe that Canada's economy is the strongest in the G7, that our jobs are the strongest in the G7 or G20, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And there is absolutely nothing farther from the truth. We are at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to that, and there are statistics that show it. Now, here's what's happening. People are saying, no, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
We said it before, I'll say it again. And if you check the headlines today, and we always say careful about the headlines, stand by that, careful by the headlines. But even the headlines are finally starting to catch up and change their tune on what they were talking about 3 and 6 months ago. We are going into recession. And there is a reason why.
Oh yeah, the climate
We've
has
lost
changed.
Hundreds of thousands of jobs here. Interest rates are through the roof. People are struggling to stay where they are. Forget about being able to buy a new home. Groceries are out of control. But we weren't seeing recession-worthy numbers yet because we were only looking at default rates at that point. But what we hadn't yet studied was the percentage of people who have dipped into their lines of credit and credit cards and second mortgages.
Yeah.
But not only dipping into them, but not even being able to make those minimum payments. So one of the huge tells in terms of the fragility of the economy or an individual's credit worthiness is when they start going over their balance. So you have a $1,000 credit card and you owe $1,001 on it, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
Not only did you barely make your minimum payment if you made your minimum payment, even if you didn't miss your payment, but because of the rate of accrual, because of the compounding effect and the interest rate accrual effect, you might make your $10 or your monthly preset payment against your balance, but the interest catches up and you're now back over your limit. Now we're starting to see, and now we're going to see the impact of that, of people who are in some form of default.
There's a delay in there, but if I can show some of my optimism, as you pointed out earlier, that I'm prone to do.
Have at it.
If history has told us anything about Canadians, is we do recover quickly from scenarios like this. This is not unprecedented. We've had economic challenges, we've had inflation, we've had challenged economies in the past, and we recover. It's almost like when we go from winter to summer in Canada. One week there's snow, and the next week we're running around in t-shirts, and we can't believe a week ago there was snow on the ground. Same sort of attitude applies towards us economically. We will recover. This is a lead-in. What I'm going to suggest here is, if you're sitting in opposition in government here, it's very easy to point fingers and show what the person in charge and their team is doing wrong. And that's precisely what Pierre Poilievre has done over the course of the summer. My question or point is, do you think some of the things he's pointing out he would do instead of or different from are going to be enough to make a dent in the housing crisis.
He's
here.
actually not. I'm going to disagree with you wholly on all of this.
Do it.
First and foremost, he's not the only guy that's pointed out what the other guys are doing wrong, which is easy enough for everybody to do.
Well, he's the one that's
And
getting
yes,
the
he's doing
headlines
it.
every night in doing it himself.
But he's also backing it up with what he would do. He's also come in with
and
a
that's
plan.
my question.
He's come in with a plan
is there
that
meat
said,
to that plan, or is it all
yes,
just window dressing?
housing and development is a provincial issue. And we're gonna don't worry. We're going to talk about what the province has done recently. But yes, it is not a federal issue in terms of actual development. Yes, it is a provincial and by extension a municipal issue. And the feds are the ones that hand out infrastructure funding.
Well, that's it.
Or a portion of the federal gas tax and
They
infrastructure
cut the
funding.
initial checks to get the ball rolling.
And so
provincially
he has
and
blatantly
federally
said,
or municipally.
depending on which rag you're reading, he has blatantly said there will be a carrot, there will be a stick. If you meet your targets, you will get infrastructure funding. If you don't, we're going to hold it back.
And I
we're
think
going to hold you
that's,
hostage for it.
I don't want to go as far as say it's brilliant, but it's certainly a necessity, I think.
It's
and
different.
It needs to be done. It is different.
Good, bad, or otherwise, it's different. And
Well,
what do we know?
it's motivation
We
one way
know
or the
that
other.
the status quo hasn't worked, and we don't just know it. And listen, we can pick on the last government for the last 8 years all we want, but even beyond them, we know, as you said off camera before we even started the show, we've been in a deficit position in housing for how many years? How many decades?
Probably since the end of World War II, when immigration started picking up again.
Okay, so every stripe has pretty much touched the pen at one
It's
point.
never been as significant as it is now, and it's never had as great an impact on our overall economy and certainly on the price of homes as it is.
So I do believe that he, and like I said, I promise we will talk about the provincial matter in just a moment, but from a federal perspective, yes, he's pointed the finger. Yes, he said enough's enough. Yes, he said enough with the deflection and talking about why carbon taxes are great for the environment and how grocery bills were giving you a $500 rebate. All this deflection and obfuscation, excuse me, English, not my first language today apparently, and all of these elements that have been talking about anything but the issue. He's finally taking the issue and taking it to task and bringing something forward. Now, here's the other thing, though, that I think is important to talk about. I am actually not on side with you about my optimism about the recovery. Yes, the economy may recover. Yes, corporations
there'll be scars
may
for individual
recover,
families.
but the individuals are the ones that I care about.
Yeah.
And this is not a, I'm not on a party platform here. But individuals are what matter and
For
who
sure.
matters, right?
Yeah.
So first and foremost, I mean, personal opinion, take some personal responsibility. Time for some
You
serious.
talking to me personally here?
Yes,
Oh.
all of us. I'm talking to myself. I'm talking to the mirror.
Who are you talking
We
to?
need to have a serious discussion inside our own homes and inside our four walls. And by the way, we shouldn't just be hiding it, walking around thinking, trying to pretend to the world that everything's great. We should be having open dialogue and discussion about, okay, listen, apparently I've been doing it wrong for a while. What is a best practice? And
Well, that's it.
And it's time to start eating my fruit and vegetables, not just chocolate cake, right? Like,
and whereas, well, if you're over 40, again, as I said earlier, we've been here before.
But
to
here's
some
the
degree,
thing,
but
Mike.
there's many people
By
that
the
millennial
time-
generation have not been here.
by the time interest rates come down or start to come down, and they're not coming down to the rates that they were anytime soon. I'm talking decades if we're lucky, okay, or if
But
we're,
let's talk
if
a
we're
bit,
unlucky.
with an election pending in the next couple of years, let's
By
talk
the
about how
time
that
rates start to come down, though, it is going to be too late for many. And that doesn't mean that they're going to, it's game over for them.
No.
But they're not going to be able to reap the benefit. They're not going to be able to enjoy those slightly decreased rates because the damage will have been done. I'm sure we got to go to break.
We
so
do.
when we come back from break, let's pick that up and carry that conversation on, because I do believe, Mike, everything that we're talking about affects you and me at home in our community, and that's what we should continue as a dialogue. So we'll be right back after this break.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. And Arif, you articulated before the break the fact that interest rates being high and its impacts on everything, I had stated that, you know, the economy traditionally in Canada will recover quickly when it does. You wanted to point out that there are long lingering and long lasting impacts of the situation that we're in right now. Like, elaborate on that a little bit more before we transition to the provincial.
Listen, Mike, I mean, and as you know, I mean, I could go on and on this for a bit, but here's the thing. We're humans, and a lot of us work instinctively, and a lot of us, you know, get excited, and we're like, you know what, I'll eat that piece of chocolate cake, and then I promise I'll go to the gym. But the challenge is that it's not that easy because we tend to not live up to our
fiscal discipline.
New Year's resolutions. Let's even go there. We sign up for the membership and we quit 2 weeks later, right? So here's the thing, and this is the thing that's been kind of plaguing me because I want to get this message across to people. When the pandemic started, and yeah, this goes back to that. When the pandemic started, people said, oh, well, I'm working from home, or I'm not ever going to go and do that commute again. And so then we quit our jobs. We started our side hustles. We started selling things on Etsy and other platforms. We got a Shopify site, whatever it is.
Well, you know what else came into its own at that point?
Yeah.
Online shopping. Amazon
online shopping
went from being just that guy, someone I know bought something there, to everybody was doing it.
Mike, do you want to go back even farther? Let's go back even farther just for a second. And I want to be mindful of our time, but I want to go back a second. Back in the 1980s, okay, our parents carried around a checkbook. And in the front of the checkbook, before we wrote the check, or maybe just after we wrote the check,
put the memo.
We carried the one, and we did that, whatever. Like, we did subtraction. We figured out what was in our bank account.
Yeah.
Today we
a
don't.
Bank book you updated every time you went in.
If it taps and it clears, we wait 10 seconds, we hold our breath, we cross our fingers, and if it clears, we're good to go. But we're not budgeting for the future. So if there's money in the account, I can spend it. Not thinking about that we're not sure if there's money in the account for that other pre-authorized payment.
Yeah. Go ahead.
For that other pre-authorized payment that was set to go out in a week from now. We're not budgeting ahead of schedule.
Our sense of money is different now because it's all virtual.
But when it comes to planning for our financing, and our biggest transaction is the house, so we always talk about that, right? Well, if I just quit my job and started another job, then I don't have 2 years of job experience, and I don't have my tax returns show, and maybe I took a hit, maybe I went from one number down to another, or I've changed industries. All of these things are being taken into consideration by the person or the department that's deciding my future on whether or not I get to qualify to either A, buy a house, or B, stay in my house. And it is important that we remember, you do have to qualify to stay in your house.
And a lot of the actions and decisions are made at the federal level that bring us to this conversation, but there's a lot happening at the provincial level.
Here's the thing that's important, though. This is genuinely important, okay? With rates as high as they are, with lines of credit that are adjustable, right? Lines of credit are adjustable. The majority of mortgages were adjustable rate mortgages. There are people with 90-year terms mortgages in Canada, and that's not supposed to be possible. But when you and I selected that thing on our contract that says, if the rate changes, keep my payment the same and defer that excess to the back end of the mortgage, well, all of a sudden when interest rates went up by 400% and people adjusted their amortization rates for cash flow purposes so that they could survive these uncertain times, all of a sudden that started adding
up. They now owe more today on their home than they did 2 years ago.
And this is why I'm not as optimistic as I would like to be. I'm trying to be realistic. We need to have a healthy conversation with ourselves. But this also impacts the rentals. And before we talk about what's going on in the province,
I have to say, though, it's a segment of our population, but it is a growing segment of our population.
If you're a developer, we see that developers have actually put a bunch of projects on hold, on the shelf. And if you're a landlord or thinking about being a landlord, there's a lot of people who don't want to get into the market right now as a landlord. Why? Because both developers and landlords, just like homeowners, have to qualify for financing. Yet, landlords have a certain set of handcuffs put on them that regardless of what happens to their expenses, we are in a rent-controlled province. And so they have to make up the gap. One, if someone doesn't pay the rent at all, but two, if their costs go up, they can't pass that on.
And they risk losing the home. altogether, and their
And as a
their credit rating.
developer,
Yeah.
if I went to the bank and investors and got my money and here's my plan and my cost to build, and suddenly my rates went up 400%,
Yeah.
and my cost of materials went up 200, 300%,
Yeah.
suddenly the project may not be viable. That's another reason why rents are high and house prices are coming down. And that's why we're having this conversation. That's why this whole weird thing that's happening makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, when you tie it all together, and you brought us in more or less to the provincial, talking
Yeah.
about developers. And well, let's start right off. If we're going to talk about provincially and developers,
Say the word.
We're going to be talking about the Oak Ridges Moraine. If we're paying any attention to news, that has been the big focus. And for those who may not know, the Oak Ridges Moraine extends. It's an area of land that was set as non-developable protected lands from somewhere towards Niagara. It extends north of the GTA all the way across to beyond Peterborough and out towards Ottawa even. It's a big swath of land, and much of that, prior to it being designated as such, was lands that were probably earmarked for development, and many developers had purchased lands to land bank and hold with the intention of developing. Some of them put subdivision plans in place that were rescinded. A lot of people lost money as a result of it. We're now at a point where our provincial government is looking high and low to find out how can we get houses building. It's the natural next step.
Natural. There's a word. I think it's important to say it.
Yeah.
This is a piece of land that, for all of the right reasons, has been considered worthy of protection. It's the most mineral-rich land that we have, and that is why you used the term third rail earlier. It is a third rail topic. I'm just so that we get the record straight. I mean, and I'm not the one who's done all the research on this. And we're referencing some reports. Obviously, it's a sensitive issue. Obviously, it has angered several
being used
people
politically.
I'm not sure if more people are angered, and I don't know. I'm genuinely saying I don't know if more people are angered by the fact that this parcel of land, this portion of land, was earmarked for development,
which is like a fragment of the overall.
It is a
Oak Ridges
fragment
Moraine.
of the
It's
overall.
but
Absolutely, and it is in there, and it is in a sensitive use area. Okay, so I don't know if more people are upset about that, or if more people are upset about the optics around how the decision was made to give it to a specific.
I think it's a bit of both.
And I do
and
believe
we do
that
have a premier who does have his ties to those within the development community. Only
Okay,
because
hang
he's in
on.
business himself.
There isn't a
So the
single
optics are
premier
there.
that doesn't have
Well,
ties.
that's the point. That's
And
the
there
point.
isn't a single politician that doesn't have ties, and there isn't a single prime minister that doesn't have ties.
it's-
Doesn't matter who you are.
But when you're in
all the
opposition, you're going to
developers
try to connect those dots and
Guess
say
what?
that
Developers-
there's favoritism.
Developers wrote me checks for my campaign.
Yeah.
They did.
Well, this is what they do. But they didn't
wrote
just write
checks
you.
to
They wrote
every
counselor.
single counselor. They
There
wrote
you go.
checks to every single mayor. They wrote checks to every because they're not idiots.
Every candidate for
They're hedging
for
their
office.
bets.
That's exactly
and
what happens.
it costs money
But what
to run.
happens then is down the road, when you can use it for political fodder, you can say, hey, that project there is being done by that developer under this premier. That premier took a check for his campaign, but they omit the fact that that developer also gave a check to every other party in that same
Every single politician gets a check. Now,
Yeah.
okay, unless you're somebody, and I got to be fair, actually, and I want to be fair because he's no longer serving on municipal council. I got to be very fair. Excuse me, Barry Ward, if you're ever watching this, I know you didn't. I know you raised 100% of your own money, and I just want that on the record. Barry Ward has never taken a check from anybody.
Yeah.
But that's beside the point. We are all allowed to receive checks, and we're all allowed to receive checks of a certain amount, and it's done for the sake of the fact that
we print
it
our
costs a
signs
lot
and
of money
flyers and everything
Yeah.
to.
So the question is, did every one of them receive the checks, and the question is, did they get unfair or unequal treatment? That's the question that needs to be asked, right?
Yeah.
And that's the question that people should be asking.
Well, what was it that the Integrity Commissioner concluded in looking into all of this with regards to?
To the best of my
Del Duca,
knowledge,
or
Doug,
who is
the premier said that he had nothing to do specifically with the selection process, and then the housing minister said the same thing, and I believe his name was Ryan Amato, if I'm remembering
yes,
correctly.
yeah.
And he's the one. Whether some people are going to say he was the fall guy, some people are going to say he took responsibility for it. Obviously, we know that the Housing Minister Clark just resigned from.
But it won't make it all go away.
From that position, he has not resigned as a member of provincial parliament. He's just resigned
he's
from that.
still sitting in his riding, but yes.
And is it the right thing to do? Is it the political strategy thing to do?
Something
yeah, you
had to
look
be
at
done
any other
to
political party in
relieve
any
the
other place, you step away.
Yeah.
So, but what's at the heart of this? At the heart of this is, for the last 10 years plus, the number one priority, the number one concern has been lack of available or affordable housing.
And
period.
The Premier, from what I can see, is not backing down from his position.
Correct.
That we need to develop some of these lands where that it'll become the pivotal debate for an election if we have one in the next. It's not for another 3 years.
I think it was pointed out earlier that this is not the first government to sort of dip their toe into some of these protected lands.
Yeah.
If you look at the previous provincial government, they certainly carved out other land for development.
Did. And
much more, to my understanding, than this.
I do appreciate when opposition as well as the media keeps our government of the day in check, keeps their eyeballs on them. But what I would say on this issue if you're stepping forward in opposition and saying, no, that project should not go forward, anything there, I would like to see also, or at least I would like to see our Premier answer back, say, okay, then, yes, fine, we won't build there then, but what's your alternative to get these X number of homes built that we absolutely need?
And that's the question that needs to be asked.
And without that being presented, an alternative being presented, I see just a tactic to try and corner the sitting government and make them.
The question to the people, as well as the
we need homes.
loyal opposition,
all politics
if you want to call them
aside,
that.
we need homes.
We need homes. So what would you have us do? It is the number one topic. It is the number one pressure. People are in trouble, and we don't want to say stop immigration, because we
given
need
the climate, as you
immigration.
pointed
We
out,
respect
developers
immigration.
are stepping back.
So what is the solution? We've talked about it before. I would like to see the government sell off their holdings, to sell off these underutilized properties that they'd have. I'd love to see us do some
federal
soil
level, they've talked
remediation.
about doing that.
I'd love to see Bradford Street get rebuilt here locally in Barrie.
Yeah.
Anything that is a brownfield, spend that money and pour it into
So there are
remediation.
answers, there are things that can be done. It's not like it's a problem that has no solution.
So the question around strong mayors, though, comes up, which is, do we then say, cut the red tape and let's get going? We're out of time. We got to go.
Yeah.
We also wanted to talk about opportunity, and I think we're going to have to save that for another show.
That's the next one. There's our hook.
But definitely, there is a time to buy, and I'm going to tell you my opinion, cat out of the bag. I think right now is a great time to buy, and there's a huge asterisk with it. And the question is about preparedness, but we do have to go.
Okay.
And I've enjoyed this.
I look forward to hearing about that next show.
Yeah, we'll pick it up, and we'll see you again next time on Heading Home with Mike and Arif.
Take care.